When children vanished, she blamed wolves, but the hogs on her farm grew unnaturally large, the schoolteacher who fed her pupils to the pigs. In 1902, the quiet town of Black Hollow, Oklahoma, was rocked by a series of shocking disappearances, children vanishing without a trace, and the only clue, huge, unnaturally large pigs roaming the outskirts of town. At the heart of the mystery stood Miss Ethel Harper, the local school teacher, someone the town trusted. But what if I told you that the pigs were no accident? What if Miss Harper was more than just a teacher? What if she was part of a twisted eugenics experiment, and the children weren't victims of wolves, but something far more horrifying? This isn't just a story about a woman and her pigs. It's a dark secret buried deep in the heart of Black Hollow, and it's about to come to light. The town of Black Hollow, Oklahoma, was one of those places that seemed trapped in time. Nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, it was quiet, serene, and at least to outsiders unremarkable. But the peace of this small town was shattered one fateful summer when the children started to disappear. It wasn't an overnight change. At first it was one child, then another, and then more. In the span of just a few months, 5 children from the town had vanished without a single trace. No signs of struggle, no blood, no screams for help, just gone. The people of Black Hollow were no strangers to hardship. It was a tough, rural place where survival meant working the land, raising livestock, and making do with what you had. But this was different. This was something no one had prepared for. The sheriff, a no-nonsense man named John Ferris, was the first to suspect something wasn't right. He'd seen plenty of things in his time: drunken brawls, livestock thefts, and the occasional wild animal sighting. But children disappearing in broad daylight? That was something else entirely. When the 3rd child went missing, he began his investigation. He scoured the area, questioning parents, neighbors, and anyone who might have seen something. But the answers never came. The town had its suspicions, of course. Some whispered about wolves. Black Hollow sat on the edge of a dense forest, and wolves weren't unheard of in these parts. But something didn't add up. Wolves? Sure, they'd hunt for food, but wolves didn't take children without a trace. Wolves didn't leave the town on edge, hearts heavy with fear. The disappearances were too deliberate, too clean. That's when the rumors started to spread. They say Miss Harper's pigs are growing larger by the day, an old man named Arthur Miller said one afternoon, as he sat in the town's only tavern, nursing a drink. "How much larger?" asked Carl, the bartender, wiping down the counter. "I've seen pigs before. They get big." Arthur leaned in, his voice lowering to a whisper. "These pigs, they're different. They're not normal. People say they're almost the size of horses. No one's seen anything like." Carl raised an eyebrow. "You're telling me a bunch of pigs grew to the size of horses?" Arthur nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "I'm telling you, something's off about that woman. Ethel Harper, she's always been a bit odd. But this is beyond strange." Miss Ethel Harper was the town's school teacher. She lived alone in a small farmhouse at the edge of Black Hollow, far enough away from the town that people rarely bothered her. She was an enigma, quiet, reserved, and always just a little too calm. No one really knew much about her personal life. She taught the children of Black Hollow, but other than that, she kept to herself. No family visits, no social calls, just her, the farm, and her strange growing pigs. The rumors about Miss Harper's pigs were becoming impossible to ignore. The townsfolk had been talking about them for weeks now. Her farm was out of sight for most of the town, tucked away behind dense trees and brush, but that didn't stop people from gossiping. They said the pigs had been acting strange, more aggressive than usual. Some even claimed they heard loud noises coming from the direction of her farm at night, as though the pigs were hungry. But hungry for what? Then came the most devastating news of all. Little Lily Baker, the daughter of a local merchant, went missing. She'd been playing near the edge of the woods, not far from Miss Harper's property. The entire town was shaken. Parents were terrified. It felt like the final straw. But what was even more terrifying was the discovery that Lily's favorite doll had been found just outside the pigsty on Miss Harper's farm. It wasn't broken. It wasn't thrown aside. It was placed carefully in the dirt, as though someone had gently set it down. The sheriff's investigation turned toward Miss Harper's farm. He had no evidence to directly tie her to the disappearances, but everything pointed to her. The missing children, the pigs, the strange behavior of the animals, it all felt connected. Sheriff Ferris wasn't a man who believed in superstitions, but the rumors had begun to gnaw at him. What was going on at that farm? Was Miss Harper involved, or was she the one being manipulated? Ferris wasn't the only one questioning Miss Harper. The people of Black Hollow were beginning to turn on her, whispering more openly about the strange things happening at her farm. Some even suggested that she had something to do with the disappearances, that maybe she had fed the children to the pigs. The rumors spread like wildfire, stoking the fires of fear that already burned hot in the hearts of the townspeople. And then, on a cold evening in late October, Ferris decided it was time to confront Miss Harper directly. He arrived at her farm just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the property. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and the faint, unmistakable odor of pigs. As he approached the barn, the first thing that hit him was the silence. It wasn't normal. The pigs were still, almost unnaturally so. It felt wrong. Ferris took a deep breath and stepped forward, knocking on the barn door. There was no answer. He knocked again. Nothing. He pushed the door open just a crack and peered inside. What he saw made his stomach churn. The pigs were there, all right huge, monstrous things that seemed to fill the space. But they weren't just fat, docile animals anymore. They were wild-eyed and looking at him with an intensity that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The pig's eyes followed him, tracking his every movement. They were too aware, too alive. But what struck him most was the size. They were far larger than any normal pig should be. The shadows seemed to stretch and warp around them, creating the illusion that they were growing even bigger as he watched. It was as though the pigs were feeding off something more than food. Something human. Sheriff Ferris' breath caught in his throat. He quickly slammed the door shut and backed away. The pigs weren't the only thing growing on this farm. Something darker, more insidious was at work. The missing children weren't just lost, they were sacrificed. And the pigs, unnaturally large and aggressive, were the key to everything. Miss Harper was hiding something, and Sheriff Ferris was about to find out just how deep the darkness ran. But this wasn't just about pigs. The real horror was still waiting to be uncovered, and it was buried deep within Miss Harper's past that no one could have ever imagined. Sheriff Ferris couldn't shake the image of the pigs, their eyes, the way they seemed to track his every movement. It wasn't normal. Nothing about Miss Harper's farm was. As he stood in the darkening woods just outside the barn, the unease in his gut grew. He had seen wild animals before, but these pigs? These were something different. He had to know more. The next morning, he gathered a small group of the bravest townsfolk. Arthur Miller, the old man who had first spoken of the pigs' strange growth, was among them. "I've been telling everyone for weeks now," Arthur muttered, still convinced the pigs were the key to the mystery. "But they didn't listen. Nobody believed me." "I'm starting to believe you now," Ferris said, his voice low and grim. He didn't know exactly what they were walking into, but he knew one thing: he couldn't let another child go missing without understanding the full picture. The group approached the barn cautiously, each step heavy with dread. The pigs, once docile, now seemed to hold a terrifying presence, as though they had a mind of their own. Their snouts were broad and their eyes sharp, like they were constantly assessing everything in their path. The closer Ferris got, the more intense the feeling of being watched grew. The door creaked open, and there they were again, those monstrous pigs, filling the barn's entire interior. Some were moving, others were still, but all were massive. The size alone was enough to unsettle anyone who dared to look at them. "This isn't right," one of the townsfolk whispered, stepping back in fear. The others murmured in agreement, their faces pale. But Ferris pushed forward, his eyes scanning the barn. He had to find something that would tie Miss Harper to this madness. The town needed answers, but as he moved deeper into the barn, something else caught his eye, something darker than the pigs themselves. A series of metal cages, tucked away in the far corner of the barn, caught the sheriff's attention. They were crude, old, and looked out of place amidst the rest of the farm's equipment. But what was most unsettling were the marks on the ground, footprints, bloodstains, and remnants of what looked like old, broken tools. He stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. The cages, they weren't empty. Inside, there were remnants of human clothing, torn shirts, shoes, and scraps of fabric that made Ferris' heart race. His mind began to piece together a horrifying image. Miss Harper wasn't just feeding the pigs. She was using the children as bait. A cold chill ran down his spine. It wasn't just the size of the pigs or their unnatural behavior that frightened him anymore. It was the fact that they seemed to be bred for something, bred to feed on something. "Sheriff, look," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling. Ferris turned to see what he was pointing at. Laying near one of the cages, partially hidden by hay, was a child's Dolly Baker's doll. Ferris's blood ran cold. This wasn't just some animal attack. The pigs weren't the source of the threat. They were the endgame. "What the hell is going on here, Harper?" Ferris muttered under his breath, but the answer was still nowhere to be found. He hadn't seen her all morning. It was like she was avoiding him, and his gut told him that she knew exactly what he was onto. As the sheriff and the townsfolk gathered their bearings, the barn door suddenly slammed shut with a deafening crack. The pigs stirred, shifting uneasily in the dim light. The low rumble of their growls reverberated in the barn, filling the air with a sense of foreboding. Ferris immediately turned to the door, his hand instinctively going for his gun. But before he could reach it, something even more terrifying happened. From the corner of the barn, a figure emerged. Miss Harper. She stood there, her silhouette faintly illuminated by the light streaming in from the barn's small windows. Her face, usually calm and collected, now seemed almost too serenely a cold, emotionless expression that chilled Ferris to the bone. But it wasn't just her demeanor. It was something in her eyes, something that wasn't human. "Sheriff," she said softly, her voice smooth like ice. "I see you found my little project." Ferris' pulse quickened. He raised his voice. "What is this, Harper? What's really going on here?" Her lips twitched into a smile. "I told you, Sheriff, you wouldn't understand, but now that you've found the truth, there's no going back." The pigs' growls grew louder, and one by one they started to move toward the group. Their steps were slow at first, but the tension in the air made it clear they weren't just hungry, they were predatory, and Miss Harper knew it. Ferris' heart pounded in his chest as he realized the magnitude of what he was up against. This wasn't just about missing children or strange pigs. This was something far worse. "You think they're just animals, don't you, Sheriff?" Miss Harper's voice broke through his thoughts. "You think they're just big wild pigs, but they're more than that, much more." Ferris' mind raced. He had to stop her. He had to stop the pigs. But how? What kind of creature could control beasts like these? What had she done? Miss Harper took a step forward, her cold gaze never leaving Ferris. They were meant to be the next stage in evolution, Sheriff. The pigs, they were part of something much bigger, something far more profound. "The children?" She chuckled softly, almost like a whisper. "They were the key, the sacrifice." Before Ferris could respond, the pigs advanced. The townspeople scrambled, trying to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. The barn was surrounded and the exit was blocked. Ferris, desperate, lunged for his gun, but the pigs were too fast. With terrifying agility, they closed the gap, their monstrous forms rushing towards him. Then Miss Harper spoke again, her voice cutting through the chaos. "They're not just pigs. They're an experiment. And now, you're part of it." In an instant, everything spiraled into chaos. Ferris fired his gun, but the pigs were already on him, their teeth snapping. The townsfolk screamed, running in all directions as the pigs tore into the barn, overwhelming them. Ferris fought back, but it was hopeless. The pigs were too powerful. In the madness, Ferris caught a glimpse of Miss Harper. She was standing, watching, her eyes cold and calculating. It was as if she were waiting for something, waiting for the moment when everything would fall apart. But just when it seemed like the nightmare would end there, a hidden truth was revealed in the chaos. The pigs weren't the only creatures Miss Harper had bred, and they weren't the only ones in danger. The sounds of chaos from the barn still echoed in Sheriff Ferris' ears as he lay motionless, surrounded by the madness. He could barely see through the blood and dust, but one thing was clear: the pigs were no ordinary animals. They were soldiers in a war he didn't even know was being waged. And Miss Harper, she was at the center of it all. He fought against the surge of panic rising in his chest. He had to keep moving, had to figure out what was happening before it was too late. But the pigs weren't the only threat. They were merely the tip of a much darker iceberg, and now, with the town on the brink of collapse, it was time to confront the truth. Through the smoke and the distant sound of screeching pigs, Ferris stumbled into the farmhouse. The walls seemed to close in around him as he entered. There was a strange, almost suffocating energy in the air. It wasn't just the heat or the smell, it was something deeper, something wrong. The house was simple, stark, but as Ferris moved through the narrow hallways, he felt like he was walking through a maze of secrets. Every room, every corner of the house felt oppressive, as though it was hiding something from the outside world, and it was. His hand brushed across a stack of old books on a rickety table. There was one in particular that caught his eye, a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Something about it felt heavy, almost as if it were waiting for him. Ferris flipped it open, his eyes scanning the first few lines, and then he stopped. His stomach twisted as he read. The journal belonged to Miss Harper's father, a man named Dr. Leonard Harper. The words on the page were chilling, detailing a twisted eugenics program he had spearheaded decades before. The goal was simple: create genetically superior humans by merging them with animals. The experiments were all-encompassing, and Miss Harper had been at the center of it. But what shocked Ferris more than anything wasn't the program itself, it was the way Miss Harper had been raised. From the moment she was born, her father had treated her as an experiment. She had been modified, her DNA altered, her genes tinkered with like an animal in a laboratory. She wasn't just part of the experiment, she was the experiment, a test subject in a project that had been hidden from the world. Ferris dropped the journal, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind raced, trying to process the magnitude of what he was reading. The truth was staggering. Miss Harper, the quiet school teacher the town had trusted, wasn't just a product of a broken world, she was the product of a system built on madness, and she wasn't alone. The journal mentioned other children, dozens of them. Children who had been taken from the town, altered, and then reintroduced into society as part of the experiment. Miss Harper had been one of the lucky Winesh had survived. But the others? They were bred, raised, and then disposed of like cattle. Their purpose had been to test the limits of genetic engineering, to see how far the human race could push the boundaries of life. As Ferris read on, a growing sense of dread washed over him. Miss Harper wasn't a passive participant. She had been the one to carry out the experiments, to raise the children and prepare them for their ultimate purpose. The pigs, they were part of the final stage of the project. The goal was simple: to create a hybrid species of humans and animals, stronger, more intelligent, and immune to disease. But there was something even darker lurking within these pages. In the final entry, Dr. Harper revealed that the children weren't just test subjects, they were sacrifices. They'd been used to fuel the hybridization process, their blood and flesh consumed by the pigs, accelerating their growth and intelligence. They weren't just animals, they were weapons. And Miss Harper, raised by her father in a world of secrets and lies, had become the keeper of the very monsters that had been created. The journal fell from Ferris' hands as his mind spiraled. This was no longer about missing children or strange pigs. This was about something far more sinister, an entire system of manipulation, experimentation, and cruelty. The pigs were no accident. They were the culmination of decades of twisted research, and Miss Harper had been its willing architect. Suddenly, a noise broke through Ferris' thoughts. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, low, deliberate, purposeful. He turned, his heart pounding, to find Miss Harper standing in the doorway, her pale face illuminated by the dim light from the kitchen. She was calm, unnervingly calm, as though she hadn't just unleashed a horror upon the town. "You found it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice a soft whisper, almost tender. Ferris couldn't speak. The truth was too much to process. But Miss Harper continued, her words slicing through the silence. "I knew this day would come," she said, stepping into the room. "I knew someone would eventually uncover the truth. My father was a brilliant man, but a flawed one. The project was supposed to save the world, make us stronger, better. But in the end, it's always the children who pay the price. It's always the innocent who suffer." Ferris stepped back, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. You did all of this?" His voice cracked with disbelief. "Yes," she replied softly. "I did. But it wasn't just me. It was my father, the town. They all played their part. They just didn't know it." She smiled, her lips curling ever so slightly. "And now, Sheriff, it's too late to stop it." A horrible realization washed over Ferris. The pigs, the children, the disappearances were all part of something much bigger. Miss Harper wasn't just a school teacher. She was the end product of a twisted experiment, and the children who had vanished were never meant to survive. They were bait, the sacrifice needed to fuel the final, horrifying step in her father's legacy. But as Ferris stood there, paralyzed by the weight of her words, something shifted. Miss Harper's face darkened, her eyes flickering with something far colder than he had ever seen. Her voice dropped to a low whisper. "You're not going to stop me, Sheriff. I've already won." In that moment, the barn doors creaked open, and the sound of heavy footsteps reverberated through the house. Ferris turned just in time to see a shadow dart across the hallway. And then it hit him, the pigs weren't just confined to the barn. They were already here, inside the house, waiting for their next meal. But the worst was still to come. The pigs weren't the only things Miss Harper had bred. There was one final secret, buried deep within the walls of this house, that would bring the nightmare to its terrifying conclusion. The walls of the farmhouse seemed to close in around Sheriff Ferris as he struggled to piece together the horrors Miss Harper had just confessed to. She stood there, her demeanor cold, her eyes betraying no hint of guilt. It was as if she had become a part of something much darker than she could ever hope to understand. And yet, she didn't care. "You have no idea what you've unleashed," Ferris spat, his voice trembling with disbelief. "Oh, I do," Miss Harper replied, her voice smooth and matter-of-fact. "I know exactly what's happened. The pigs, the children, the experiments. My father was a visionary, but he failed." Her lips twisted into a tight smile, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm finishing what he started." Ferris took a step back, Her words felt like a weight pressing on him, suffocating him. He had always believed that the human race was capable of great things, but what he was hearing, this was something entirely different, something monstrous. She stepped closer to him, her footsteps deliberate, as if she were savoring the moment. "You think I'm some kind of monster, Sheriff? You think I'm evil?" She let out a soft laugh. "I'm not. I'm a product of a system that was created to make us all stronger, better. But my father couldn't see it through. So, I did. I finished it. I gave the world what it needed." "What it needed?" Ferris' voice cracked. "You've turned children into sacrifices. You've fed them to those pigs. What kind of monster are you?" Miss Harper's smile didn't fade, but her eyes grew colder, distant. "You still don't understand. The pigs, they're not just animals. They were the final piece of the puzzle. They were meant to evolve, to become something more than just livestock. They were meant to be the culmination of years of genetic manipulation. My father had a dream, an idealistic dream, but I perfected it." Ferris felt his heart pound in his chest. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but what he was hearing was too much to comprehend. "They weren't just breeding pigs," Miss Harper continued, her voice becoming eerily calm. "The program was designed to create a new race of beings, stronger, smarter, impervious to disease, able to withstand anything. My father used human and animal DNA to create a hybrid species, and the pigs, they were the final step of evolution in its purest form." Ferris couldn't believe it. The idea that a human could be bred to such an end, to become part of an experiment like this, was inconceivable. But the more he listened, the more it made sense. The pigs weren't mindless creatures that were intelligent, strategic, and monstrous. They were bred for this purpose. The children were just the start. My father used their DNA to modify the pigs, but the pigs were never meant to stay animals, Miss Harper explained, her voice low and chilling. "When I fed them the children and I fed them the blood, they began to grow, to evolve. And as they grew, so did their minds. They became more than just beasts. They became the soldiers in a new world." Her words cut through the air like a blade. The world she described wasn't one he could recognize. It wasn't a world of laws or morality, but one where evolution was controlled, manipulated for the sake of power. Ferris' mind raced with images of the pigs, of the children who had vanished, their lives sacrificed in the name of science. And now Miss Harper's voice trailed off as she stepped toward the window. "Now, we have reached the next phase of the experiment. The pigs, they've adapted. They've grown smarter, stronger, and they're no longer confined to the barn. They're out there, Sheriff. They're waiting." Ferris' stomach churned. He turned toward the door, his mind frantically searching for a way out. The pigs, those horrible, intelligent monsters, were not just confined to the farm anymore. They had spread, and soon they would be everywhere. But just as he was about to make his move, Miss Harper's voice stopped him. "You think you can stop them?" she said, her tone mocking. "You think you can stop me? The pigs have already won. My father's dream is finally realized, Sheriff. The world will never be the same again." Ferris felt a surge of desperation. He couldn't let her win. He couldn't let this madness continue. He grabbed his gun from his belt, his fingers trembling as he aimed it at her. "You're sick, Harper. This ends now." She didn't flinch. Instead, she stood there, her expression as cold as stone. "It's already over, Sheriff. The pigs are out of your control, and so am I. There's nothing left to do but wait for the rest of the world to catch up." Ferris fired, but the shot was too late. The moment the bullet left the chamber, a sudden crash from outside shook the farmhouse. The pigs, they were here. Ferris spun around, eyes wide with terror. He could hear their massive bodies thrashing through the trees, their grunts and growls growing louder with every passing second. The ground seemed to shake beneath him as they approached. "Miss Harper, you have to stop this," Ferris shouted, his voice desperate. "You've lost control. They'll tear the town apart. They're not just animals anymore, they're a weapon." Her gaze never wavered. "The world will change, Sheriff. You'll see. The pigs will lead the way." With that, the door to the farmhouse exploded open, and the pigs charged in, their massive forms filling the doorway. Ferris had no time to react. He raised his gun, but it was too late. The pigs were upon him. As the monstrous creatures closed in, Miss Harper simply stood there, watching with a cold, almost satisfied expression. The nightmare she had started had perfected was now spiraling out of control. The world would never be the same. But even as the pigs swarmed around Ferris, something darker, more dangerous, was still lurking in the shadows. The pigs weren't the only creatures that had evolved, and the final horrifying truth was still buried beneath the surface. The pigs were no longer just animals. They had become something else entirely, creatures, born of twisted science, genetic manipulation, and unspeakable sacrifices. Sheriff Ferris had seen them for himself. Massive, intelligent, hungry, and now as they charged through the farmhouse, there was no denying the truth. They weren't just victims of circumstance, they were weapons. Weapons Miss Harper had unleashed on Black Hollow, and soon the entire world would pay the price. Ferris' mind raced, but his body was frozen with fear. The pigs, their monstrous forms filling the doorway, growled with an intelligence that sent chills down his spine. They were no longer just mindless animals, they were calculating, aware of their power. He took a deep breath, steadying his aim, and fired. The shot rang out, but the pigs didn't flinch. In fact, they barely seemed to notice. They were too focused, too driven, and Ferris realized horrifyingly that he was facing a force much greater than any animal had ever encountered. These pigs weren't just big, they were smart, and they had evolved. Miss Harper stood behind him, watching with that same calm, detached expression. "You think the gun will stop them? You think your weapons can hold back what my father started? These pigs are no longer just livestock. They're the future." Ferris' breath caught in his throat as he took in her words. The pigs weren't just genetically modified to be stronger, they were designed to lead. And now, they were far beyond anything he had imagined. They were never just pigs, Miss Harper continued, stepping forward slowly. They were part of the grand experiment. They were meant to be the next step in evolution, stronger, faster, smarter. But what my father failed to understand, what I understand now, is that they can be more than animals. They can be the ones to lead us into the future. Ferris' grip on his gun tightened, but he couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger. He was out of his depth. What could a simple bullet do to something that was no longer just an animal? These pigs had been bred to be weapon stools of destruction, capable of wiping out entire cities if left unchecked. "They've learned," Miss Harper said almost lovingly as she looked at the pigs. "They're not just hungry for food anymore. They're hungry for power. They understand what they are, and they know what they want, and they know how to get it." Ferris felt his knees buckle. He was standing in the center of a nightmare he could never have predicted. The pigs were more than just modified, they had developed their own form of intelligence. Their eyes, once dull and animalistic, now gleamed with purpose, as though they were waiting for something, someone, to command them. Miss Harper was right. The pigs weren't just beasts. They were the next stage in evolution, and she had helped create them. They were intelligent, strategic, and hungry for dominance. The realization hit Ferris with a crushing weight. The town of Black Hollow was just the beginning. Miss Harper's experiment was far from over, and the pigs were only the first wave. Suddenly, one of the pigs, the largest, with glistening black eyes, stepped forward. It was different from the others. Its massive form loomed over Ferris, and for a moment, he was paralyzed with fear. He couldn't move, couldn't think. The pig's eyes locked with his, and something in its gaze made him feel like prey, like an insect caught in a web. "Do you see it now, Sheriff?" Miss Harper's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence. "Do you see what I've created? They're more than animals. They're smarter than you could ever imagine. They were bred to think, to lead, and soon they will." Ferris' eyes never left the pig. It was watching him, studying him, calculating. It wasn't just an animal looking for food, it was looking for something more. And Ferris realized, with growing horror, that the pigs weren't just after the town, they were after power. Power to dominate, to spread, and to control. Suddenly, the ground shook beneath them. The walls of the farmhouse creaked, and the floorboards trembled as the pigs moved with disturbing precision. They weren't just roaming. They were organizing, coordinating their movements as if they had been trained to do so. They had become something more than the product of genetic manipulation. They had become a force of nature. "They're not the only ones," Miss Harper continued, her voice a haunting mix of pride and something darker. "They were the beginning, but I've gone further. I've bred them with something more, something stronger." Ferris' eyes darted around the room, searching for an answer, a way out. The pigs were closing in, and Miss Harper stood there, watching it all unfold. She wasn't just the keeper of this nightmare, she was the architect of it. The pigs were her creations, her children, and they were ready to take over. And then Ferris saw Ita's shadow moving in the corner of the room. It wasn't one of the pigs. It was something else. Out of the darkness emerged a creature that could only be described as a grotesque hybrid. It was a fusion of man and beast, its body large, muscular, and covered in a mixture of fur and skin. Its eyes were human, intelligent, and filled with an eerie understanding of the world around it. It was no longer just a Pidgeot, was something far worse. Ferris' heart stopped. He was looking at the result of Miss Harper's final phase. The pigs had evolved into something far more dangerous. They had become a new species, altogether human-animal hybrids, bred for dominance and intelligence. "This is the future, Sheriff," Miss Harper said, her voice filled with a dark satisfaction. "And there's no going back." Ferris felt his legs buckle, the weight of the moment crashing down on him. He had walked into a nightmare far beyond anything he could have imagined. The pigs were no longer just animals, they were soldiers, soldiers of a new world, a world that was about to be reshaped by the creatures Miss Harper had created. But just as Ferris thought it couldn't get worse, the creature the hybrid took a step forward, and with it, the realization hit him. The pigs weren't the only things evolving. The experiment was far from finished, and the next phase was about to begin. But as Ferris' world seemed to crumble, he realized one terrifying truth. The pigs weren't the only creatures Miss Harper had bred. There was something even darker waiting to emerge, as something that would change everything. Sheriff Ferris' hands trembled, the weight of the moment crushing him. The hybrid creature, a grotesque blend of man and pig, stood before him, its eyes glinting with an unnatural intelligence. But what terrified him most wasn't the creature, it was the woman behind it. Miss Harper, the quiet school teacher everyone trusted, had bred this abomination. "What have you done, Harper?" Ferris' voice cracked, caught between disbelief and horror. Miss Harper's lips curved into a smile. "I've perfected what my father started." "You don't understand, Sheriff. This is evolution." The hybrid stepped closer, sniffing the air like it was assessing him, deciding whether he was a threat or prey. Ferris couldn't move. The pigs, the missing children, the strange happenings, it all came together in one monstrous truth. This wasn't about Black Hollow anymore. It was about something far bigger. "You've created monsters," Ferris rasped. "They're not monsters," Miss Harper said softly. "They're the next step in human evolution." Her voice was calm, clinical. "The hybrids," she explained, "weren't just animals. They were the future, stronger, smarter, designed to outlast mankind itself." The town had been her testing ground. The children, her raw material. A low growl filled the room. The hybrid's muscles rippled as it advanced. Ferris reached for his gun, but Harper shook her head. "Don't bother," she whispered. "They don't fear you. They understand you. And once they understand, they replace you." Ferris felt the truth settle like a stone in his gut. She wasn't just breeding beasts, she was building an army, a new species. He had stumbled into the extinction of humanity. Then came a soft metallic click from the far corner of the room. Ferris turned. A hidden door was opening in the farmhouse floor, the air behind it colder, thicker. Miss Harper's smile widened. "You're about to see the next phase of my work, the one I never meant anyone to find." The hybrid beside her turned toward the sound, almost reverently. Something was moving in the dark. Then a shape emerged, taller, thinner, disturbingly human in outline, yet utterly alien. Its skin was gray and taut, its head too large, its black eyes reflecting the lamplight like wet glass. Ferris' heart stopped. This thing wasn't like the others. It was the culmination, the final product of Harper's deranged science. "This one," she whispered, "is the pinnacle of my father's vision. The others were practice. This is perfection." The creature stepped forward with deliberate grace. It wasn't mindless, it was aware. And Ferris could see it thinking, analyzing him, judging him. His instinct screamed to run, but the door behind him slammed shut. He was trapped. "What are you planning to do with them?" he demanded. Miss Harper's tone turned reverent. "They will lead the world into a new era. Governments, borders, humanity itself are all obsolete. The future is theirs." Ferris could barely breathe. She believed this. She truly believed these horrors were meant to rule. He gripped his gun tighter, knowing it was useless against something that shouldn't exist. The hybrid beside her leaned forward, its gaze fixed on him. It wasn't angry, it was curious. It understood him. It saw him as something ancient, outdated. Ferris aimed his gun anyway. If this was evolution, then he was the last man standing between civilization and the abyss. But before he could fire, the creature's eyes flickered an unsettling sign of thought, of recognition, and Miss Harper's smile changed. She looked proud and terrified, because in that flicker she realized what she had created could now think without her. As the light dimmed and the creature turned its gaze from Ferris to her, one thing became clear: Miss Harper's experiment wasn't finished. It was evolving, and its next target wasn't mankind. It was her. Sheriff Ferris' pulse thundered in his ears as he faced the hybrid creature, the ultimate product of Miss Harper's father's eugenic nightmare. Its black eyes gleamed with awareness. It wasn't just an experiment gone wrong, it was evolution turned against its maker. But what chilled Ferris more than the creature was the realization that Miss Harper hadn't acted alone. Someone or something had helped her, and the deeper he looked, the clearer it became. Black Hollow itself was built on this horror. The whole town was part of the experiment. Miss Harper tilted her head, her calmness almost mocking. "You still don't understand, do you? You think this is about me?" "Oh, Sheriff, it's never been about me." Ferris' voice shook. "Then who? Who's behind this?" She smiled, a cold, deliberate curve. "You think my father worked alone? No. He had funding, protection, believers, people who wanted to shape humanity's future. Black Hollow was their testing ground. A town built for one purpose said, "Oh, hide what we were creating." Ferris felt his stomach twist. "You're saying the town's leaders knew?" "Oh, they knew enough," she said. "The council, the mayor, even your predecessors in that badge of yours say all played their parts. They just didn't realize the cost." The hybrid shifted, letting out a low, almost human growl. Ferris realized with horror that Miss Harper was right. The town's peace had been an illusion built on blood and lies. The missing children, the wolves she blamed it, had all been a cover for feeding the experiment. "Why the children?" His voice cracked. "Why feed them to the pigs? The pigs weren't just livestock," she murmured. "They were the bridge. My father discovered they could absorb human DNA, integrate it, transform it. The pigs that grew so largathos were the ones that consumed human matter. And when they bred," she smiled faintly, "they gave birth to something new, something perfect." Ferris stared at her in disbelief. "You've been breeding these things right under everyone's nose. They're not things," she snapped, her composure faltering for the first time. "They're the future. My father saw humanity's limits, disease, weakness, decay. He wanted to rewrite evolution itself. Black Hollow was the start, but I've taken it further." The sheriff stepped back, mind racing. This wasn't just about a mad woman, it was a conspiracy generations deep. The town hadn't been a victim, it had been designed for this. He thought of the children's family as their fear, their silence. Maybe they had known too. Maybe everyone had chosen not to see. Ferris' grip tightened on his gun. "You can't control what you've made, Harper. You think they'll obey you, but they won't." Her expression turned eerily serene. "That's where you're wrong. I don't control them. I guide them. They know their purpose. They understand it better than you ever could. The world is ready for something stronger." Before Ferris could reply, the hybrid let out a guttural roar. The floorboards shook as it lunged forward, but the farmhouse door burst open. A dozen townsfolk poured in, led by Arthur Miller, the man who had first warned him about the pigs. They carried rifles, torches, anything they could find. Arthur's face was grim. "We know, Sheriff. We know what she has done." The hybrid turned on them, snarling, but Ferris fired first. The bullet struck its chest, and the creature staggered, its scream echoing like a dying animal and something else, something human. The sound froze everyone. Miss Harper's voice broke through. The chaos, trembling with fury. "You fools. You think killing them will stop this? There are more. You've only seen the beginning." But it was too late. The townspeople surrounded her. The nightmare that had been hidden for decades was now out in the open, and there was no going back. Ferris' eyes locked with Miss Harper's, then well burn it down to the ground. Her smile returned then, knowing. "You can burn Black Hollow, Sheriff, but you can't burn evolution." Ferris fired again, and her words were swallowed by the gunshot. As the hybrid fell and the fire began to spread, Ferris realized something she hadn't lied about. This wasn't the end. If the experiment had spread beyond Black Hollow, if others had continued her father's work, then the real fight hadn't even started. But as flames tore through the farmhouse, Ferris heard something that froze his blood, a distant, rhythmic pounding from underground. The hybrids weren't all dead. Something deeper was moving, and it was waking up. Sheriff Ferris stood at the edge of the farmhouse, his gun still raised, eyes locked on the hybrid creature lying motionless on the floor. The bullet had done its job, but barely. It wasn't dead, just weakened, disoriented. The creature growled, a deep primal sound that sent a shiver through Ferris' bones. He could feel the air change, thick with tension. The hybrid wasn't the only threat now. As the creature struggled to regain its footing, Miss Harper stepped toward it, her face a picture of cold determination. "You think you can stop this?" she asked softly, her voice eerily calm, as though the chaos around them was simply an inconvenience. "You think you can stop what my father started? What I've perfected?" Ferris tightened his grip on the gun, but Miss Harper's gaze didn't waver. She wasn't afraid. She knew the true power of what she had created. The hybrids, the pigs, and everything she had unleashed, they were just the first wave of something much bigger. "You're wrong, Sheriff," she continued, her voice growing colder with every word. This isn't just about me. This is bigger than all of us. The pigs are only the beginning. My father's dream was to create a new race of beings. And now I've made it a reality." Ferris took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had come here to stop her, to stop this nightmare. But the more he learned, the more he realized this wasn't just about Black Hollow. This wasn't just about the pigs or the hybrids. This was about something global, something that would change the world as they knew it. The stakes had become much higher than anyone had anticipated. "You've bred monsters," Ferris spat, his voice shaking with disgust. "And now you are going to let them destroy everything?" Miss Harper's eyes darkened, her smile faltering for the briefest moment. "Monsters? No, Sheriff. They're the future. The pigs are evolving, the hybrids are evolving, and soon there will be nothing left but what we've created. The world will belong to us." The hybrid, still struggling to stand, let out another growl. Its eyes flickered with a strange recognition, as if it understood every word Miss Harper had said. And it wasn't just the hybrid. The other hybrids, the pigs, everything that Miss Harper had bred was part of a grand plan that she had been orchestrating from the beginning. But there was one thing Miss Harper hadn't counted on. The town was beginning to fight back. Arthur Miller, the old man who had first spoken of the strange pigs, stood beside Ferris. He was holding a rifle, his hands steady, his gaze focused. He wasn't just a witness anymore, he was part of this fight. And as Ferris glanced at him, he saw the resolve in his eyes. Arthur knew this wasn't just about saving Black Hollow. It was about saving the world from what Miss Harper had unleashed. "We're not going to let you get away with this, Harper," Arthur said, his voice low and steady. Miss Harper looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "You think you can stop us? You think you can stop them?" Before Ferris could respond, the hybrid still twitching with life lunged forward. It wasn't just a reaction. It was calculated. The creature moved with the kind of precision Ferris had only seen in the most intelligent predators. It wasn't attacking out of instinct. It was attacking because it knew they were a threat. Ferris fired, but the creature dodged, its speed shocking. The bullet missed, and the hybrid barreled toward them, teeth bared, eyes glowing with savage intelligence. In that moment, Ferris realized the full extent of Miss Harper's creation. These weren't just modified animals. These were soldiers, trained to hunt and destroy. They had been bred to think, to plan, to lead. Arthur raised his rifle, firing at the creature, but it was too fast. The bullet grazed its side, but the hybrid barely seemed to notice. The creature was upon them, slamming into Ferris with a bone-shattering force. He hit the ground hard, his breath knocked from his lungs, the weight of the hybrid pressing down on him. Then, just as quickly as it had pounced, the creature was pulled off him by a loud, guttural screech. Ferris scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting around. He saw Miss Harper standing in the corner of the room, her hand raised, her fingers twitching. The hybrid creature had stopped mid-attack, as though it were obeying her commands. "What the hell are you doing?" Ferris shouted, struggling to regain control of the situation. "You're controlling them?" "Of course," Miss Harper replied with a twisted smile. "They're my creations. I've trained them. I've perfected them. They do what I say. They do what we say." Ferris' mind spun. The hybrids weren't just physical creatures, they were weapons of control. Miss Harper had harnessed their intelligence, their instincts, and now she was using them to carry out her will. The pigs, the hybrids, the entire experiment, none of it was random. It was all part of a carefully calculated plan to take control, to reshape the world. "You won't win, Ferris," said, his voice firm, even though his body was still shaking from the creature's attack. "You can't control them forever." "I already have," Miss Harper said, her voice icy. "And soon I won't need to control them. They'll take over for me. I've shown them how. I've shown them their purpose, and they won't stop until the world belongs to them." The hybrid creature stepped back, its eyes flickering with something Ferris couldn't quite place. It wasn't aggression, it wasn't obedience, it was understanding, as if it had learned everything it needed to know. And then, the unthinkable happened. The hybrid turned away from Ferris and Arthur. It wasn't running away, it was leaving. It moved toward the door of the farmhouse, its massive form blocking the way, and then, with a chilling growl, it exited. Ferris stared at the door, his mind racing. What did it mean? Why had it left? "I told you," Miss Harper said, her tone triumphant. "They don't need me anymore. They're evolving, and when they do, they'll take control of everything." But just as Ferris was about to process this, the sound of an explosion rattled the walls. The ground beneath them trembled. "What the hell?" Arthur shouted, looking toward the source of the explosion. It wasn't the farmhouse that had shaken. It was the town. Black Hollow had just taken its first direct hit from the experiment. The hybrids were no longer confined to the farmhouse. They were spreading, taking over, and now they had begun their invasion, and Miss Harper's work was far from finished. The nightmare wasn't contained. It had only just begun, and as the town of Black Hollow burned, Ferris realized one horrifying truth: the hybrids were smarter than anyone could have ever imagined, and they were just getting started. The ground trembled beneath Sheriff Ferris' feet as the explosion rattled through the air. Black Hollow wasn't just under siege, it was being consumed. The air smelled of burning wood and metal, the distant roar of the hybrids echoing in the valley. The pigs, once confined to the farm, were now roaming freely, their terrifyingly intelligent eyes gleaming with the knowledge that they were no longer animals, they were predators, and the town of Black Hollow was their prey. "Get to the woods," Arthur Miller shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. "Get to safety. They're everywhere." Ferris nodded, his mind racing. He couldn't fight this battle alone anymore. He couldn't fight the hybrids in Miss Harper's nightmare of a world. But he could save the people who still had a chance if they could just make it out of the town alive. As the townsfolk scrambled to flee, Ferris and Arthur moved quickly, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the hybrids. But the real threat wasn't the creatures themselves, it was what Miss Harper had done to them. She hadn't just bred them for power. She had given them the ability to think, to lead. And now they were organizing. They weren't just attacking, they were planning. "We can't outrun them, Arthur," Ferris said, his voice grim. "We need to find a way to stop them." Arthur nodded, his face hard with resolve. "I know, but how? They're everywhere, and Miss Harper's got control over them." "We take her down," Ferris said, his mind already working. "If we can stop Miss Harper, maybe we can stop them. Shez the one who's controlling them, isn't she?" Arthur hesitated. "But how? Shez got them all under her thumb. Shez not just some mad scientist anymore. Shez a general, and those hybrids are her army. We're just two men. Two men who know the truth," Ferris shot back, his voice steely. "Two men who know what Shez capable of." The sound of a shrill, bone-chilling growl echoed through the air, cutting through the tension. It was the hybrid. It had returned, and this time, it wasn't alone. Ferris' heart pounded in his chest. He could hear the rustling of the trees as the hybrid moved through the woods, its massive form blending with the shadows. It wasn't just hunting. It was leading the others. "We have to move now," Ferris shouted, but as he turned to run, he was knocked to the ground by the sheer force of a massive body slamming into him. The hybrid. It had found them. With its claws digging into the ground, the creature snarled, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. But this time, Ferris wasn't alone. Arthur lunged forward, brandishing his rifle, and fired. The shot struck the hybrid square in the chest, but it barely flinched. Instead, the creature let out a guttural roar and swiped at Arthur, sending him flying backward with terrifying speed. Ferris reached for his gun, but before he could fire, the hybrid turned and ran back into the woods, vanishing into the shadows. The air was thick with the sense of something much darker lurking just beyond their reach. The hybrid hadn't attacked to kill it, had attacked to send a message. "Stay low," Ferris hissed, pulling Arthur to his feet. "They're using tactics now. They're not just animals, they're thinking." Arthur winced as he regained his footing. "We're outnumbered." "We're not out of options," Ferris replied, his voice firm. "We know where Miss Harper is. Shez at the farmhouse. We stop her. We stop the hybrids." Arthur nodded, his eyes dark with determination. "Lead the way." The farmhouse, once a quiet retreat at the edge of town, now stood as the epicenter of the nightmare Miss Harper had unleashed. It was dark, the windows shattered from the explosion that had rocked the town. The once sterile walls, now marred by the blood of the hybrids and the pigs, told the story of a descent into madness. The faint sound of growling echoed through the air, the unmistakable growls of creatures waiting for the signal to strike. Ferris and Arthur moved cautiously toward the building, their steps light but purposeful. The air felt thick with tension, the weight of what was at stake pressing down on them with every breath. As they neared the farmhouse, Ferris' mind flashed back to everything he had learned at the pigs, the hybrids, the twisted legacy of Miss Harper's father. The reality of the situation settled in. This wasn't just about saving the town. It was about saving the future. The world had changed, and if they didn't act now, there would be no stopping it. Inside the farmhouse, Miss Harper stood alone, watching them with that same cold, calculating gaze. Her eyes didn't flicker when they entered. She knew they were coming. She was waiting for them. "You're too late, Sheriff," she said, her voice soft, almost tender. "You can't stop it. I've already won." Ferris stepped forward, his voice steady. "You haven't won yet. It's not too late to stop this." Miss Harper smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory, it was a smile of certainty. "It's already over. You see, Sheriff, I've been planning this for so long. This town was always meant to be the test, and now the world will see what we've created. The hybrids will lead the way, and the world will bend to them." Ferris' fingers tightened around his gun. "You're not just controlling them, are you? You've made them more than just your soldiers. You've made them leaders, and now they are spreading." Miss Harper's smile grew wider. "Exactly. The hybrids aren't just creatures of flesh and bone. They're the next step in evolution. And once they take their place, everything will change. Everything." A low growl filled the room. The hybrid from earlier stepped out of the shadows, its eyes locked on Ferris. It wasn't alone. More hybrids appeared, surrounding them, their eyes glowing with the intelligence of creatures who had evolved beyond anything Ferris could have imagined. But just as Ferris raised his gun, ready for the final fight, Miss Harper made a chilling announcement. "They're not just here to kill you, Sheriff," she whispered, her voice thick with triumph. "They're here to replace you." The hybrids growled again, and this time, Ferris didn't hesitate. He fired. But just as the first hybrid lunged forward, a new figure appeared in the doorway, a new player in the game, one who would change everything, and this time, Ferris had no idea what he was about to face. The farmhouse was burning. Sheriff Ferris stood at the edge of Black Hollow, watching as the flames consumed the very place where the nightmare had begun. The sound of crackling wood and the distant growls of the hybrids filled the air. The town that had once been peaceful, isolated from the rest of the world, was now a war zone. And it wasn't just the town that was under siege. Ferris realized with a sinking feeling that the entire world was in danger. The hybrids, those creatures born of twisted science, had become more than just predators. They had become the leaders of a new world order. The old world was crumbling, and there was no turning back. Arthur Miller stood beside him, his face grim. "We did what we could, Sheriff, but it's not enough. It's too late." Ferris nodded, his gaze still fixed on the burning farmhouse. The fire was symbolic, he thought, a fitting end to the nightmare that Miss Harper had started. But it wasn't. Just her work that had brought this destruction. It was the legacy of her father, the twisted dream of a new species, a species that was now free to spread, to evolve, to dominate. "We can't just let this end like this," Ferris said, his voice low, filled with a mixture of anger and defeat. "We have to stop them. We can't let them take over." Arthur shook his head, his eyes heavy with the burden of what they had witnessed. "You don't understand, Sheriff. It's not just about stopping them anymore. The hybrids, they've already started spreading. They are not just in Black Hollow, they are everywhere. And we've only seen the beginning." Ferris felt the weight of his words, the crushing truth of what they were up against. The hybrids, bred for power, intelligence, and domination, had already begun their invasion. The town had been their first test, their proving ground. But now that they had tasted freedom, there was no telling how far they would spread, how quickly they would evolve. Miss Harper was just the catalyst, Ferris muttered, his mind racing. Her father's experiment wasn't just meant for Black Hollow, it was meant for the world. And now, we're paying the price. The fire continued to burn in the distance, but Ferris couldn't shake the feeling that the flames weren't enough to destroy what had been unleashed. Black Hollow might be lost, but the hybrids were still out there, still growing, still evolving, and they weren't going to stop until they had taken over. Arthur sighed heavily, the weight of the situation settling over him. We should have known. The signs were all there. The disappearances, the pigs, the strange behavior. It was all part of a bigger plan. We were just too blind to see it. Ferris' thoughts flashed back to the early days of the investigation, when the town had started to notice the first signs of something wrong. The missing children, the unnatural growth of the pigs, the rumors. He had dismissed them, too focused on the small town mysteries to see the larger truth. Miss Harper hadn't just been a teacher. She had been the architect of this nightmare, and now the world was paying the price for it. "There has to be something we can do," Ferris said, his voice rising with frustration. "We can't just sit back and let them win." Arthur's face darkened. "There's nothing left to do. We're out of time. The hybrids are out there, Sheriff. They're evolving faster than we can keep up, and the world will never be the same." Ferris turned toward Arthur, his mind racing. There had to be a way to stop this. There had to be some way to undo the damage Miss Harper had caused. But how? How could they fight something that had already evolved beyond anything they could understand? Then the sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. A figure appeared out of the smoke and shadows. Miss Harper. Her clothes were torn, her face smeared with blood, but she still stood tall, her eyes filled with a strange, unsettling calm. She had survived the explosion. She had survived the fire. But Ferris knew she hadn't just survived. She had planned for this, and now she was standing before him, her expression one of quiet triumph. "You think you've won, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice cold, detached. "You think you can stop it? You can't. The hybrids are already too powerful. They've already begun spreading beyond Black Hollow, and nothing you do will change that." Ferris' fingers tightened around his gun. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. He wasn't going to let her destroy the world she had helped create. "Why?" Ferris demanded. "Why do this? Why sacrifice everything your father's legacy, the town, the people for this madness?" Miss Harper's smile was cold, calculating. "Because it was meant to happen. My father's vision wasn't just about control. It was about evolution. The world wasn't meant to stay the same. The hybrids are the future, and I will be remembered as the one who brought it all into being." Ferris' mind raced, but before he could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. It wasn't the fire, it wasn't the explosion, it was the hybrids. The sound of their growls, their movements, filled the air. They were closer than ever. And then, the truth hit Ferris like a sledgehammer. Miss Harper hadn't just been playing the role of a mad scientist. She had been playing the role of a prophet. She had known this day would come. She had known that once the hybrids had evolved, they would come for him, for Arthur, for the whole town, and they would destroy everything in their path. The ground shook again, louder this time. The hybrids were no longer lurking in the shadows. They were out in full force, ready to take over, and the world wasn't ready for what was coming next. Miss Harper didn't even flinch as the chaos around them escalated. She knew this was the end, but to her it was only the beginning. Ferris stood, facing her, his resolve hardening. He couldn't stop them all. He couldn't save the world. But he could stop Miss Harper. He could stop the one person who had started it all. In the distance, the first of the hybrids appeared, its eyes locked on Ferris. The war had begun, and Ferris was the last line of defense, final payoff. But even as Ferris prepared for the final stand, the hybrid paused, its gaze shifting toward Miss Harper. For the first time, Ferris saw something in its eyes, a flicker of recognition. And in that moment, he realized Miss Harper hadn't just created a weapon, she had created a new world, one that no longer needed her. And with that realization, the first hybrid turned away from Ferris, and for the first time, the sheriff understood the true price of playing God. The hybrids weren't just her creations, they were her legacy. And now, they were free.